When you think of the Phoenix Desert, you definitely aren't thinking of a waterfront. The canal system goes right through the center of Phoenix. The more people that were moving to the area, the more that the trails along there were being used for walking, running, biking. There are not many crimes that are like this one. You had women riding bicycles along the canal on a typical Phoenix evening, ambushed, stabbed multiple times.
Police are looking for whoever killed 22-year-old Angela Brasso.
Angela Brasso dismembered, decapitated. Police are looking at this scene and thinking, what on earth happened and who did this?
10 months later, a 17-year-old junior at Arcadia High School, Melanie Bernis. This is the high school that Steven Spielberg attended. Melanie Bernis's mother goes out to dinner, and Melanie decides to go on a bike ride. And the following morning, a woman is riding her bike.
Right here, there was just a big puddle. It looked different as I rode through it, and all of a sudden I'm like, that is blood.
So she called the police. The police saw a blood trail, and they see Melanie Bernis's body at the bottom of the canal.
My time and my life froze at that very moment, the day we found out. I made a promise to myself. I just never stopped talking about her.
These murders became widely known as the Phoenix Canal murders.
My name is Clark Schwarzkopf, and I was assigned to the cold case unit investigating the canal murders. I think there was over 600 persons of interest. I said, okay, give me the list. In this mound of information of all these people and all these possible suspects, I believed our killer was listed.
Eventually, Detective Schwarzkopf found his prime suspect on that list and discovered that the alleged canal killer had a second identity. A man who dressed up like a comic book superhero and cruised the valley in a decorated car dripping with fake blood. The public knew this man as the Zombie Hunter.
What was his life as the Zombie Hunter like? What did he do?
He would go to parades and festivals and show off this car and kind of be a part of the excitement, if you will.
Your assignment was to find this guy, and you have found him.
Yeah.
He is accused of being a killer, but here he is posing with police officers before they discovered what he'd done.
It was almost like a slap in the face, like, I'm here, but you don't know it.
It was like he was hiding in plain sight.
It's one of those cases that you just don't forget. You can't unsee what happened to those girls. You just can't.
Long before the man known as the Zombie Hunter became the prime suspect in the canal murders, Clark Schwarzkopf was a detective with the Phoenix Police Department's Cold Case Squad. His mission was simple but pointed. Find the killer responsible for those vicious murders of two young women from the early 1990s.
To this day, I'm still not exactly sure about what happened on those bike paths.
The case began on November 8, 1992. Angela Brasso, a tech worker who had recently moved to Phoenix, was taking advantage of beautiful weather to get in a little exercise, says Brianna Whitney, the true crime reporter for the CBS affiliate KPHO in Phoenix.
Each night, she would go out for her evening bike ride, just at golden hour at sunset, the best time to be riding out here.
Angela was only hours away from turning 22 years old. And like a lot of locals, she liked to bike on the paths that ran alongside the city's distinctive canals, says Schwarzkopf, a 48 Hours consultant.
Are there places that are sort of natural ambush sites if somebody wants to attack someone?
Yeah, they are. There's a lot of tunnels that go underneath the interstate.
That November evening in 1992, Angela left her apartment around 7 p.m. Her boyfriend, Joe, later told police. He said he stayed home to bake Angela a birthday cake and didn't expect her to be gone long.
Hours go by, and Joe grows concerned. Angela hasn't come home, and that's not like her.
Joe told police he took his bike out 3 times that night, frantically searching for Angela on the canal paths. He spoke to her friends, even her mother back in Pennsylvania. Finally, he reported Angela missing to police. The next morning, searchers came upon a horrific scene.
Angela Brasso's torso was found in a field next to the trail that she had been riding her bike on.
Angela had been stabbed to death. Some 10 days after Angela's headless body was discovered, a man fishing along this section of the canal spotted her head stuck on a grate.
And from what we have heard from witnesses, the head was in amazingly good condition, especially considering this was days after the murder.
I'm Morgan Lowe, and I'll take you.
Morgan Lowe, an investigative reporter who also works at KPHO and is a consultant for 48 Hours, has been working on the Canal Killer case for more than a decade.
We've heard that the head looked like it had been preserved, like it was a memento for the killer.
Angela's purple mountain bike was also missing. There were no solid leads, and the case went quiet until September of 1993, some 10 months after Angela's murder, when the mother of 17-year-old Melanie Burness returned from a dinner date to find her daughter had broken her curfew and was not home. She then noticed that Melanie's bicycle was missing.
Melanie decides to go on a bike ride. By around 10:30, when Melanie did not return, her mother started calling her friends. Is Melanie there?
Well, my mom took the phone call, said that Melanie's mom was frantic and, nervous.
Rachel Shepmaker was one of Melanie's close friends in high school.
So initially, when you hear that her mother's looking for her, you're not thinking something terrible has happened to your friend.
Definitely not. I thought she was with a friend and just forgot to communicate with her mom where she was.
Early the next morning, Charlotte Pottle, a local resident, happened to be riding along the canal with her young daughter in a bicycle seat. Just as they came out of one of those tunnels that ran under the interstate, she spotted a puddle.
There was just a big puddle of something. Ended up riding right through it and having it splash over me.
Charlotte says something about the puddle bothered her. So a few minutes later, she doubled back. That's when she made that horrible realization.
I could tell that it was a puddle of red, that it was a puddle of blood. And all of a sudden, as I'm looking at it, I noticed that there are some drag marks that went along over here.
Toward that tree?
Towards that tree, yes. And then went around the tree and was dragged back. You could see the drag marks right here to the canal.
Charlotte went home and called police. Later that night, the local news reported that a woman's body had been found in the canal, close to where Angela Brasso's head had been located.
They found the body in a teal bodysuit. I was told by some other friends that Melanie did not own that. It can't be her.
Rachel went to sleep convinced the body in the canal was not Melanie. But the next day,
I'm at school. My friends just come up to me crying and saying it was Melanie.
detectives strongly suspected Melanie had been targeted and stabbed in the back by the same person who had killed Angela.
Police believe that somehow the killer got her off of her bike, whether he knocked her off of her bike or whether he asked her a question.
Clark says the evidence indicates the killer approached the women from behind.
Both the knife wounds were the exact same position.
Investigators say the killer dragged Melanie's body off the canal path, removed her clothes, and dressed her in that teal bodysuit, similar to this one obtained by police.
Along with the stabbing and the dismemberment, there was another component to these murders, wasn't there?
Yeah, both women were sexually assaulted.
And that meant investigators had a crucial piece of evidence: DNA.
When the DNA from Melanie's scene was finally tested later, it matched to Angela's scene, so we knew for sure that we were dealing with the same perpetrator.
Investigators noted that the initial stab wounds to the backs of each woman were fatal and so precise that detectives suspected the killer might be a surgeon.
The details about what happened were the kinds of things that kept parents from letting their kids out when the sun went down.
The murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness in the early 1990s created fear in Phoenix that lasted for a generation.
You know there's some guy out there and you don't know where he is.
They watched the news and read the newspaper every day, hoping that police would make an arrest. And it just kept going on, and nothing, and nothing, and nothing.
Investigators had collected matching male DNA from both the victims. But more than 2 decades passed, and the canal murder cases went cold. Then, science finally caught up with the calendar.
It's in 2014. Phoenix police detectives are at a DNA conference, and a forensic genealogist from California is also at the conference.
Colleen Fitzpatrick, founder of Identifinders International, was there to meet with law enforcement.
And she goes up to these detectives and says, hey, I can take Y chromosomes and create these DNA profiles and try to match with genealogy to help solve criminal cases.
Fitzpatrick's company had developed software that could mine public genealogy databases, searching for matches to crime scene DNA. The detectives heard her out.
And then several weeks later, they sent me the Y DNA profile from the crime scene for the Phoenix Canal murders.
Fitzpatrick's company started crunching the data, hoping to provide Phoenix detectives with a name.
We entered the numbers from the forensic profile into our software, and that's where I came up with 6 matches to the name Miller.
While the genetic genealogy search produced the name Miller, it is also one of the most common last names. Detective Schwarzkopf started digging.
You check your files, and what do you find?
I think there were a total of 6 Millers that were on what I called my master list. And I went down through the list, got to Bryan Patrick Miller.
But who was Bryan Patrick Miller? Records show he was 42 years old with a Phoenix address. That name was just one of more than 600 persons of interest who had lived in those case files for years. Police at the time seemingly never pursued Miller.
We discovered his file downstairs.
Police learned Bryan Miller had a record dating back to before the canal murders, In May of 1989, when he was just 16 years old, Miller crossed paths with Celeste Bentley.
I was 24, and I was going to work. I had just noticed a young boy on the bus.
Celeste says she and the boy got off at the same stop. Moments later, she felt something in her back.
He had ran by me. I thought he had just hit me. I just yelled at him. I was like, why'd you do that, you know? And then I reached back and touched my back and realized that it was blood. I had been stabbed.
With a single knife wound to her upper back, Celeste screamed and managed to make it to the store where she worked. A coworker called for help. About 30 minutes later, when Celeste was in the back of an ambulance,
the police came and said they found him, and they wanted to bring him to the ambulance to show him to me.
Celeste identified her assailant. Bryan Miller was charged with aggravated assault.
They said that if he had held the blade the other way, he would have gone straight through my ribs and I could have died.
Miller pleaded guilty and was sentenced to juvenile detention until he turned 18. It was a far cry from where Miller's life had begun.
He was living in Hawaii for a while as a kid with his mom and his dad, but his dad died early on in a motorcycle accident.
Years later, Miller and his mother Ellen moved to Phoenix.
So for most of his life and early years, it was Bryan Miller and his mom.
While Miller was in juvie, his mother made a disturbing discovery.
Bryan Miller's mom was looking through his stuff and she found a note that he wrote.
The pages detailed a sinister plan: kidnap the girl, tie her up in the truck, and cut her clothes off.
This note spelled out how he wanted to find, abduct, rape, murder, and dismember a young woman. And Bryan's mom was so disturbed by this piece of paper that she took it to Phoenix police.
It was Miller's 18th birthday, and he had just been released as an adult.
She flat out told the police at the time that she was really scared for her safety and that she was not going to allow him to come home.
So after his release, Miller ended up at this Phoenix halfway house. When Schwarzkopf read that note in 2014, he was struck by something.
There was a lot of things in there that were close or similar to what happened specifically to Angela,
including a description of decapitating a victim and preserving the head. Phoenix police wanted to locate Miller. Luckily, he was very easy to find. In December 2014, Phoenix police continued digging into potential suspect Bryan Miller, who they discovered was actually a local celebrity.
Everybody at the time in the Phoenix area knew Bryan Patrick Miller as this character called the Zombie Hunter.
The Zombie Hunter, like a comic book character?
Yeah, like a comic book character, like a good guy fighting the bad guys.
Miller's alter ego was a costume figure who participated in parades and festivals around town.
Thousands of zombies taking over the streets of downtown Phoenix.
He wore this long trench coat with these goggles and helmet and had this large Gatling gun.
And if you're going to hunt zombies, you need a way to get around.
He bought an old police car and tricked it out, wrote the Zombie Hunter on it.
And it had a full-size zombie mannequin in the back and blood on the side.
Friend Eric Braverman says Miller's Zombie Hunter persona attracted a big fan base, including law enforcement officers who lined up to pose with him.
Collected pictures of himself with the cops like trophies. They're all smiling big with him, leaning on the car.
Eric says Miller's superhero character was the opposite of what Bryan was like when he wasn't in costume.
He seemed like a harmless marshmallow that was immersed in this goofy lifestyle. He's just that unassuming guy.
But could Miller be the Canal killer? The only way to find out was to get his DNA. Investigators began to surveil Miller, who worked at an Amazon warehouse. Every day when he got there, Miller parked the zombie mobile in the same spot.
He would come out for his 15-minute break, blast his music really loud. Lunchtime, came out to the car, same thing, blast this god-awful music.
Schwarzkopf came up with an elaborate plan to get his DNA.
I went up and introduced myself to Miller. He was in his car.
What did you introduce yourself
I introduced myself as a security consultant.
Schwarzkopf told Miller that thieves had been stealing goods from a warehouse across the way.
I said, would you be interested in working for me as a security officer, watching the building while you're outside?
Did his eyes light up?
Yeah, because it was a good paying job. I said, look, I'll pay you $20 an hour.
On January 2nd, 2015, Schwarzkopf met Miller at this Chili's restaurant to fill out a job application. The cold case unit was behind the scenes, ready to bag anything that had Miller's DNA on it, such as utensils or a glass.
They set a table for me and Mr. Miller away from everybody else in a part of the restaurant where nobody else is at.
Miller arrived with a surprise guest, his 15-year-old daughter, Sarah. Miller was a divorced single dad.
He was very gentle and caring about his daughter. He often brought his daughter where he would be going.
The trio sat down and ordered hamburgers. When the food arrived,
he swallows his hamburger in like 5 bites, won't take a drink of his water, and I'm sitting there going, are you sure you don't want something else to drink? Because you just got water? No, I'm good.
Schwarzkopf started to worry this operation would be a bust.
What does he finally do that makes this mission accomplished?
We finally took a drink from the water glass. That's when I knew that, okay, now we've at least got his DNA.
Despite knowing about Miller's juvenile record, as their meal ended, the veteran detective's gut told him Miller was not their man.
Seeing him with his daughter, I just don't see this guy as being the monster in 1992 and 93 that would do this to these women.
Miller gave Schwarzkopf a quick tour of his zombie hunter mobile, and the two parted ways, with the detective saying he'd be in touch. The cold case unit sent Miller's water glass off to the crime lab. 11 days later,
we got a call from the lab, and we're sitting there and we're like, what is this all about?
And in this meeting, these Phoenix detectives say, as a joke, they must have solved the Canal murders.
But Detective Schwarzkopf says it was no joke when the head of the lab arrived.
She leans down to me, she goes, it's him. And I go, what? She goes, Bryan Miller, it's him. Well, the blood rushed from my head. I kind of sat back and I went, you've got to be kidding.
Bryan Miller's DNA from that water glass matched the DNA recovered from Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness more than 20 years before. Miller was arrested within hours. During a police interview shortly after, Miller was told why he'd been taken into custody in connection with the Canal murders.
We have DNA that links you to those two ladies.
See how that's possible.
He just kind of went through it in his dopey, kind of, I don't know what you're kind of talking about.
It would help you get it off your chest if you did something like that.
I didn't kill anyone.
You didn't kill anybody?
No.
Investigators got a search warrant for Miller's house, the home he shared with his teenage daughter, and just about everything he'd ever collected in his life.
I can remember like it was yesterday, walking up to the front door and everybody going, you can't get in that way. It's full of crap.
Bryan Miller's house was like it came from the show Hoarders.
There was a little path where you could get to a bathroom and the kitchen and where the TV was, and that's it. Everything else is just stacked to the roof with garbage.
Did you look around and go, this is madness?
Not only madness, I go, this is a nightmare.
Schwarzkopf and his investigators would have to sift through all of it, looking for other possible evidence. Detective Schwarzkopf also focused on a news source, someone Miller himself had ominously singled out in his interview.
It's the one person on the face of the earth that I could probably honestly say I hate.
Miller's ex-wife, Amy, who would end up revealing gruesome details from Miller's violent past.
He had told her about the murder of a young girl who had come to his door accidentally.
What do you think motivated Bryan Miller to dress up as the Zombie Hunter? See more of the case on Facebook at 48 Hours.
In January 2015, more than 21 years after the Canal murders, Bryan Miller was charged with first-degree murder in both Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness's deaths. Melanie's friend Rachel Shepmaker says she felt a wave of relief.
A very joyous moment of, oh my gosh, this is what we've been waiting for decades upon decades.
Detective Schwarzkopf wanted to talk to the one person who probably knew Miller best, his ex-wife, Amy.
They had been married for 8 years. There was a divorce.
Amy told Schwarzkopf that she was just 19 when she met Miller in 1996. They married less than a year later and moved to Everett, Washington. Amy had a shocking revelation for the detective. She told Schwarzkopf Miller had revealed a gruesome secret to her, that he had killed a young girl in Phoenix years earlier, before he'd ever met Amy. Schwarzkopf says Amy never reported it to police before for a number of reasons. She didn't know if it was true, she was afraid of Miller, and she said she wanted to be a good wife.
You support your man no matter what.
Detective Schwarzkopf says Amy told him what Miller had said.
That a young girl had come to his door, that he had grabbed this young female, pulled her in, killed her immediately.
Amy said Miller told her he dismembered the girl and disposed of her remains in trash left on the curb. Although Amy claimed Miller never told her the child's name, investigators used the information Amy provided to piece together who Miller may have been talking about.
13-year-old Brandy Myers was a little girl collecting money for a school book-a-thon in her North Phoenix neighborhood, going door to door.
I was a tomboy and she was a girly girl.
Brandy's sister, Kristen Dennis.
So she would try to learn how to climb trees or jump fences because she wanted to play with me. She was my best friend.
It was May 26, 1992, 6 months prior to the murder of Angela Brasso. Miller was living in the halfway house following his time in juvenile detention for the aggravated assault of Celeste Bentley.
This is 1 block from our school, his home, and then 3 blocks is our house. So every single day, we walked right by here.
Kristen says Brandy left home alone that evening, never to return.
She was last seen 2 doors down from Bryan's, walking in the direction of his house.
Despite an extensive search, Brandy's body was never found. Schwarzkopf says even though Amy couldn't provide a name, the clues in her account add up to just one conclusion.
I believe that person is, in fact, Brandy Myers.
Her sister believes that as well.
Brandy went to the landfill like something of no importance.
Even with Amy's account, investigators did not have enough evidence to charge Miller in Brandy's disappearance.
So the fact that she was disposed of, there's just nothing physical, nothing forensically to grab onto.
48 Hours contacted Miller, who said he had no involvement in Brandy's disappearance and never confessed to Amy that he had killed a young girl. But there is another case in Miller's past.
In 2002, a woman named Melissa Ruiz Ramirez is walking down the street in Everett at night, Somebody pulls over.
It was Bryan Miller. Melissa would later tell police she'd seen him before talking to a friend of hers. Melissa said she got in Miller's car and told him she needed to make a call, and he drove her to his workplace so she could use the phone.
She tells police she's on the phone, and from out of the clear blue, Bryan Miller comes running out with a 12-inch serrated kitchen knife and stabs her in the back. They fight over the weapon.
Melissa said she escaped and contacted police. They picked up Miller shortly after. He didn't deny stabbing Melissa, but claimed it was self-defense. He said he was at work when Melissa walked in off the street and asked to make a call.
He said she goes to use the phone, and then all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, she tries to rob him with a knife.
Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. He was jailed from May 2002 until his December trial.
The jury just didn't buy Melissa's story. It was a he said, she said, and they acquitted him of the charge.
Amy says a chilling change followed Miller's return home. She said it began with the letters she'd received from her jailed husband while he awaited trial.
They first started out as professing his innocence, and then it would turn into sexual deviance. Like, here's what I'm gonna do when I get out, to you.
Amy told Schwarzkopf that Miller followed up his words with action.
She said he came back with an unbelievable, ugly, dark, sexual deviant side that she'd never seen before. There were times where there was sex between them where he held a knife to her throat.
Amy told Schwarzkopf that Miller claimed something happened to him as a child, something that would become the cornerstone of his defense for murdering Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis. His unique defense?
Call the first witness.
His mother had created a monster. At the start of Bryan Miller's trial for the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis in October 2022, his attorneys opened with a startling defense. They admitted their client was the Canal killer.
They had to concede right off the bat that he is the actual killer, but that he was not guilty by reason of insanity.
His defense attorneys say Miller was tortured by his mother, Ellen, as a child, and that led to his violent sexual behavior. She died in 2010.
If you imagine the making of a monster, this is kind of the household that story begins in.
Miller told investigators after his arrest that the beatings began when he was just 5 years old.
She was a detention officer. Discipline in their house was mental as well as physical.
She used her security belt, so it was like a law enforcement belt, and usually I hit by the buckles.
The defense opted for a bench trial, which meant there would be no jury. His lawyers told Judge Suzanne Cohen that Miller's mother also exposed her young son to violent sexual content.
He was exposed to her interests in pornography and extremely violent films.
Miller's lawyers said his mother's abuse caused Miller to develop severe mental health problems.
He feels like there are different TVs playing in his head.
Psychologist Bethany Brand testified that Miller developed a condition known as dissociative amnesia, an inability to remember some traumatic events. Morgan Lowe summed up the defense argument.
There were two Bryans. There's the one you see over there at the defense table, who's a fairly normal person, who has friends, who had a job, who was a dad, who was a husband. And then there's the killer. There's bad Bryan.
And Miller claimed his attorneys had no memory, none, of the two murders he was charged with.
Prosecutors undermine the defense claim that Miller has no memory of the killings. They point out that he does remember details related to other stabbings.
Remember, Miller admitted stabbing Celeste Bentley when he was 16 years old. And in 2002, he had also testified about the stabbing of Melissa Ruiz Ramirez in Washington. To show Miller's deviant side, prosecutors called the only person in the world Miller said he despised, his ex-wife, Amy. The judge did not allow cameras to record her face. Under questioning by prosecutor Elizabeth Reamer, Amy testified that later in their marriage, Miller grew increasingly violent during sex.
Did you ever say anything to him about wanting it to stop because it was scary?
No.
Why not?
I was avoiding any confrontation with him at all at that point, and wanted to be as compliant as possible so that I would stay. Will he love me enough not to kill me?
Did he ask permission prior to using needles on you?
No.
Did he ask permission prior to tying you up?
No.
What percentage of your sex life after he got out of jail in Washington included bondage, the pins, or other things that were not the normal sex you'd been having early in your marriage?
Probably at least 95%.
The trial continued, and after 6 months and 36 witnesses, the judge delivered her verdict.
As to count 1, first-degree murder, Angela Brasso as follows: guilty. As to count 2, first-degree murder, victim Melanie Burness as follows: guilty.
How did Bryan Miller react to the guilty verdict?
He didn't react. He didn't give any real emotion.
But Angela's mother, who addressed the court remotely, was emotional.
The defendant broke my heart, took all hope and light from me and my family. The hole in my heart is so big and empty.
Melanie's older sister, Jill, also spoke remotely about how painful it was that Melanie's life ended violently at the age of 17.
For 30 years now, we've had to live without Melanie because the defendant murdered her. Words cannot even begin to describe the level of excruciating pain we experienced with the news of her horrific death.
Miller, who didn't take the stand during his trial, was allowed to give a statement before he was sentenced.
I'm not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and the friends of the victims. I cannot imagine what pain they have endured for all these years. I know I'm different. I thought it had to do with what my mother did to me.
Defense counsel R.J. Parker urged Judge Cohen to show mercy before she delivered her judgment on Miller's sentence: life in prison or death.
You do not have to kill Bryan in order to see justice done.
Judge Cohen agreed with the centerpiece of the defense case.
The defendant's abuse as a child was proven.
But 8 months after the trial began, Miller's abuse at the hands of his mother did not dissuade Judge Cohen from handing down the ultimate sentence.
There is no question that what the defendant did deserves the death penalty. Mr. Miller, anything you wish to say to the court?
I guess thanks for listening to everything that was said and giving us at least the opportunity to try and convince you otherwise.
Justice was carried out in this case.
Detective Schwarzkopf hopes family and friends of Angela and Melanie might finally find some peace. people like Rachel Shepmaker.
Just knowing that justice was served, it doesn't make anything easier.
How do you want your good friend be remembered?
Just that she's the all-American good kid. I want her family to know that we haven't forgotten her. She's changed us all for the better. She was a gift.
A knock at the door by a clown, an evil clown.
The evil clowns you see in the movies, well, it came to life.
Who comes calling with balloons, flowers, and a gun.
I heard bang. I saw her fall. This was an assassination. Who isn't afraid of a killer clown?
48 Hours, Saturday on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
Welcome to 48 Hours Postmortem. I'm CBS News correspondent Anne-Marie Green, and today we are talking about an episode that truly sent shivers down my spine, Unmasking the Zombie Hunter. So joining me now are 48 Hours correspondent Peter Van Sant and producer Paula Rosa, who reported on and produced this episode. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hey, Anne-Marie, happy Halloween.
It's a perfect episode for Halloween. It says it in the name, right? The Zombie Hunter. But before we get into the episode, let's play a clip from the show.
There are not many crimes that are like this one. You had women riding bicycles along the canal on a typical Phoenix evening, ambushed, stabbed multiple times.
Brianna Whitney, the true crime reporter for the CBS affiliate KPHO in Phoenix, says the first victim was 21-year-old Angela Brasso, whose body was found in November 1992.
Police are looking at this scene and thinking, what on earth happened and who did this?
10 months later, the body of 17-year-old Melanie Burness was found in one of the city's canals. Investigators found the same DNA at both scenes, says Detective Clark Schwarzkopf.
I think there was over 600 persons of interest.
After some 20 years, investigators zeroed in on 42-year-old Bryan Patrick Miller, a divorced father raising his teenage daughter. As Schwarzkopf soon learned, Miller had a unique alter ego.
Everybody in the Phoenix area knew Bryan Patrick Miller as this character called the Zombie Hunter.
Schwarzkopf secured Miller's DNA. Days later, the head of the forensic lab had some news.
She leans down to me, she goes, "It's him." And I go, "What?" She goes, "Bryan Miller, it's him."
Peter, what stood out to you about this case that made you want to do it?
Well, first, the zombie killer. I looked it up. You know, a zombie is relentlessly aggressive, reanimated human corpse, right? So you have that component, which I found fascinating. And then for me personally, I lived in Phoenix for 4 years. I worked in local news there. This was just before these canal murders I left. But my home was about 3 miles from where these murders occurred. I used to jog along the Arizona Canal. And back then, it was a hub of people on the canal. When we went and shot this, it's amazing. There's no one on these anymore. That's how lifestyles were changed in this. I also have this never-ending curiosity about why do people kill. It's one of the reasons why I do this job. It's one of the reasons why I love to try to talk to the accused, to get inside their head. And look at the head of this man. He was in this costume like a comic book character. Instead of going off and hiding under a rock somewhere, this alleged killer was out in the public, posing with photographs with police officers, for goodness sakes, going to these sci-fi conventions. And he sounds like such a psychologically complicated person where you hear these stories of him being a sweet, loving father to his daughter, friends who thought he was engaging. They never sensed danger with this man. Sometimes he was a bit odd, but he had this Jekyll and Hyde personality.
Like Peter said, that's what's fascinating about murder. It's these two sides. And in this case, you know, Bryan's lawyers said he had two sides, that he had a trauma side and he had a normal side. He was not the zombie hunter when he committed the murders of Angela and Melanie back in the early 90s. And they were vicious. I mean, these women are women who went out for nighttime bike rides along this busy canal path in Phoenix in good weather. And, you know, Angela was the first victim, and her head was cut off. She was beheaded, and the head was not found until 10 days later. So, and she was eviscerated. I mean, these are horrible, horrible crimes. And Melanie, you know, she was found stabbed to death. So, so because of the nature of the crimes, the cops always felt that it had to be a surgeon who did them or someone with special forces training. And there's a military base in Phoenix. And they just didn't believe it could be Bryan Patrick Miller, who was around 21 or 22 years old at the time of these murders. And when you meet him, he's like a marshmallow. People describe him as a marshmallow. He couldn't do one push-up, his friends said. He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who could commit these horrible crimes.
Can we talk about how Melanie was discovered?
This was a story that Paul managed to find a woman by the name of Charlotte Pottle. And this was literally as we were finishing up our hour. We'd already written the show and most of our editing was done, but Charlotte Pottle was worth the effort. Back in 1993, she was riding along the canal when she drove through a dark puddle. She instantly felt like something's not quite right here. That was really bizarre. She rode for just a few minutes and decided to double back and realized that it was a pool of blood. And she got off of her bicycle, and Charlotte noticed that there were drag marks in the dirt. The first drag marks went off away from the canal to a single tree. She said the body had been moved around that little tree, and there was a small pool of blood there. The body is then dragged back across the path to the edge of the canal where it apparently was thrown in. And so Charlotte Pottle, she later called police, and she called them on an emergency tip line that was not supposed to reveal the identity of the caller. And she described her experience and told cops, you should go out there and check it out for yourself. Well, sometime later, she gets an unexpected call from a homicide detective. And the homicide detective said in a very demanding way, "Where are you right now?" And she goes, "Well, I'm at my house." "Stay put. I'm on my way over to talk to you. Do not move." So she waits at home. She said the detective shows up, and he immediately accuses her, Charlotte Pottle, of being the killer. And why? Because her footprints were on both sides now of these drag marks out at the canal. And he says, "I know you did this." She said, "I had nothing. I just discovered it." She thought she was going to be arrested. He leaves, and she's convinced any moment she's going to be arrested as the canal killer. She said they never call again, and they never showed up. And she lived with this fear for months. But Charlotte did the right thing.
Yeah.
And luckily she wasn't charged.
That's an incredible story, Peter. You know, you talked about the surgical precision almost. Her head was pretty well preserved. What do police believe happened to
Peter,
that?
you can talk about that.
So when this head is discovered, according to Detective Clark Schwarzkopf, he believed that the killer had kept the head in a refrigerator. It was a head that he may have considered a trophy. And in the plan, this handwritten document that Bryan Miller had produced, that his mother had discovered and turned over to authorities, one of the items on his list was to decapitate a victim and to keep the head. And Detective Clark Schwarzkopf believes that's exactly what happened here, and that he wanted it discovered because Detective Schwarzkopf believes he wanted to get some shock value from these murders.
So, Paul, how did you get to know him?
Well, I started writing him emails, And, I couldn't reach him during the trial because his lawyers are in the way, and they obviously won't let him speak to a journalist during the trial. But after the trial, I took a chance, and even when he's on death row, but even on death row, inmates have access to email, which a lot of people out there may not know. And I didn't know if he'd write back or not. And the first time he wrote back, he said he didn't like CBS News. I said, well, I've been doing this a long time. I've worked at the show for 30 years. So I've been doing this a long time, and you can Google me and you can check me out. And, I think I'm an upstanding journalist, and I'm not going to lie to you or anything. And he started writing. So we went back and forth, and I started asking him simple questions at first, like, what do you miss? Do you miss being the zombie hunter? And he said, you asked me simple questions, so I'm going to answer you. And we just kept going on until eventually he started talking about the case more and more. And he said he didn't commit these murders. And I said, well, Bryan, that leads to the big question. How is it that your DNA was found on both women? And he said, that's the $1 million question. If I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here, would I?
Wow. So let's talk about that, because then there's these 2 murders. There's a stabbing earlier, but 2 murders, and then nothing.
Bryan seemed to have cleaned up a little bit in the late 90s. He married Amy. Mm-hmm. He got married, and she, by the way, described him as the perfect gentleman on their first date, which was at an amusement park by the side of the canal where they found one body and Angela's head. So he married her and in Phoenix, and then they moved to Washington State, where his mother lived. They had a child, and there's some video of them from the time on a whale watching trip, and they look like any young family, know. And so we don't think Bryan really changed his ways. He stabbed a woman up there. He said it was self-defense, and that case went to trial, and Bryan Patrick Miller was acquitted. The jury believed him over the woman.
Wow. So the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis went unsolved for decades. And like so many of these cases that are only now getting solved, the real smoking gun in this one is the DNA evidence that pinned Bryan to these murders. But police almost didn't get it. Let's take a listen to investigator Clark Schwarzkopf describing just how they got the crucial evidence at a Chili's of all places.
The cold case unit was behind the scenes, ready to bag anything that had Miller's DNA on it, such as utensils or a glass.
They set a table for me and Mr. Miller away from everybody else in a part of the restaurant where nobody else is at.
Miller arrived with a surprise guest, his 15-year-old daughter, Sarah. Miller was a divorced single dad.
He was very gentle and caring about his daughter. He often brought his daughter where he would be going.
The trio sat down and ordered hamburgers. When the food arrived,
he swallows his hamburger in like 5 bites. Won't take a drink of his water. And I'm sitting there going, are you sure you don't want something else to drink? Because you just got water? No, I'm good.
So good news is he's really hungry. Bad news is he's not thirsty.
That's right. And it went on and on. And by the way, the other people that were in that section of the restaurant were undercover agents.
I wondered about
watching.
that.
And the manager of the Chili's, a great citizen, this woman said, I'll be the waitress. So she played the waitress in this scenario. And finally, he takes a sip from his water glass. And that's when Schwarzkopf knew this was mission accomplished, as we said in the story, that he got the DNA sample. So Clark Schwarzkopf, was a seasoned detective, right? This goes back to the duality of Bryan Miller. He had approached him at his place of work. He posed as a security guy. He said, would you like to work for us, keeping an eye on the back part of the factory here because there's been some theft. I'll pay you $20 an hour. Well, anyway, he got to talking with him back and forth, right? Got a sense of the man. Then they have this lunch together, brings in his daughter. He seemed like a loving father. He seemed normal. And despite what Schwarzkopf knew of his past, he felt as though this guy, this nerdy, soft-spoken man, he couldn't possibly be the Canal killer. And so he gets the DNA sample and they send it off. But in his mind, he goes, it's going to come back. It's not going to be a match because there's no way, based on my experience,
that this guy is a killer. He's just too nice a guy. It's kind of extraordinary, but it shows you the power of his personality.
Wow. So they get all the evidence they need. They've got this DNA match, and so they get a search warrant for his house. And it's like this guy has never thrown anything out. He's basically a hoarder. Let's listen to a clip from the show.
I can remember like it was yesterday, walking up to the front door and everybody going, you can't get in that way. It's full of crap.
Bryan Miller's house was like it came from the show Hoarders.
There was a little path where you could get to a bathroom and the kitchen and where the TV was, and that's it. Everything else is just stacked to the roof with garbage.
Did you look around and go, this is madness?
Not only madness, I go, this is a nightmare.
Yeah, this was a nightmare. They have to look through this stuff. It's a house filled, completely filled to the ceiling with stuff. And they are looking for women's bikes from back then. He had a lot of bikes when they arrested him, but none were Melanie or Angela's bikes. They're looking for a murder weapon, a knife. They found a lot of knives, but not the murder weapon.
Wow.
But they did find a lot of pornography, some of it violent. So it's just a nightmare.
So, still a lot more to talk about. When we get back, I want to talk about Bryan's ex-wife and his daughter, Bryan's juvenile record, and, of course, the trial. What will the zombie hunter with his larger-than-life persona, what will he use as his defense strategy? We're going to get into that after the break. Welcome back. When I look at this case, I cannot help but to think about the people in Bryan's life. Can you tell me anything more about the ex-wife? I was shocked that a man like this had custody of his teenage daughter. How did that happen?
Well, at the time, I would say that his ex-wife, Amy, had lived a troubled life. As far as I've learned, she did not come to the final custody hearing, and the judge awarded Bryan custody of his daughter. Bryan always treated his daughter, Sarah, with respect and kindness from what we learned. She had a fairly normal upbringing, although she did live with him in the house, which was described as a hoarder house. So, that comes with its own psychological underpinnings. But other than that, living in a hoarder house, they seem to have a really good, loving relationship.
In a way, that brings me back to the ex-wife, too, because he was a good husband until he wasn't, according to her. She must have told the court about her experience. I mean, she was terrified of him.
One thing about Amy is that, and she testified to this, is that she felt intense duty as a wife to do whatever her husband wanted her to do. She said that at trial. It was her duty to do what he wanted. Coupled with that is that she was really afraid of him. And it's heartbreaking, but at one point in the trial, the prosecutor says, why didn't you object to all this stuff in the bedroom? And she said, well, I wanted to do it because it's my duty as a wife, and I wanted to be sure that he loved me enough not to kill me.
Jeez, that's heavy and heartbreaking.
It is. So that sort of sums up where she's coming from. You got to feel great sympathy for her.
Completely. I want to ask about the juvenile record, too. How much access do investigators have to a juvenile record typically?
Well, these juvenile records usually are kept under seal, but these investigators were able to get that information about him. He had stabbed a woman in the back and been arrested for that and served time in juvenile detention. So Celeste Bentley worked at a mall, and she took public transportation to get to her job. She's on this bus, and she notices this young man behind her a few rows. She turned. She noticed he was looking at her. And when she got off the bus, she noticed that the young man got off as well. And this was very early in the morning. And she's walking across an empty parking lot headed toward the department store where she works. And then all of a sudden, he sprints by, and she feels this punch, she thought, on her back, and it hurt. And she called out to him, "Oh, why'd you do that?" And she put her hand back and discovered it was blood. Then she runs to the department store. There was a single door. It was locked. She's pounding on it. Luckily, one of her colleagues is there, lets her inside, and they call the police.
But she said the police told her that if he had turned the knife just a little bit one way, it would have gone right through and it hit her aorta also.
It could have been a murder.
Yeah, it could have been a murder. So the police found Bryan dressed in different clothing. So he had planned this. He changed his clothes. They brought him over to Celeste, and she identified him. And he eventually pled. And he admitted to the cops that he had stabbed her. There's various stories about why he did. One was he said he just wanted to see what it felt like, and it sent chills down his spine. There were other reports later that he stabbed Celeste because she reminded him of his mother.
The thing about Celeste Bentley, I interviewed her. This is a woman that has lived with this trauma, obviously, for her entire life. It so impacted her life. She was afraid to be in crowds. She's always had her head on a swivel, always looking around her, and still does.
Yeah. Part of his defense was to talk about his childhood. So looking at his childhood, the abuse that he alleges, what proof was provided?
Well, it began, the fact that when he was 16 years old and he committed that attack, it turned out that he had told social workers back during the juvenile detention that he had, he told these details of his mother's abuse. And so the fact that he had told with such detail and very specific about the kinds of things, exposing him to pornography, exposing him to violent movies, beating him. He tells this story of being beaten with a belt, experiencing violence, psychological trauma, physical trauma, and then exposed to these horrible images is something that he kept with the rest of his life.
So that becomes kind of part of the defense, right? Let's just listen.
Psychologist Bethany Brand testified that Miller developed a condition known as dissociative amnesia, an inability to remember some traumatic events. Morgan Lowe summed up the defense argument.
There were two Bryans. There's the one you see over there at the defense table, who's a fairly normal person, who has friends, who had a job, who was a dad, who was a husband. And then there's the killer. There's bad Bryan.
And Miller claimed his attorneys had no memory, none, of the two murders he was charged with.
Keep in mind, the prosecutors disagreed. They believed that he seemed to have memory of other traumatic events that he could recall and say, I didn't do that. Events in which people were stabbed but survived, somehow he still remembered that. So, I mean, does the skeptical part of me still wonder about that? Of course.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed just too convenient.
Mm-hmm. Bryan decided not to take the stand during the trial, but he gave a statement. Let's just hear a little what he had to say.
I'm not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and the friends of the victims. I cannot imagine what pain they have endured for all these years. I know I am different. I thought it had to do with what my mother did to me.
These kinds of cases, the families involved, this man created, torturous lives for so many people, caused such profound harm.
Yeah.
The horrors that he did.
Yeah.
To lose your child and to lose it under these circumstances where there was mutilation and things, a family never gets over that, can't get past it.
Another fascinating case, another just incredibly baffling character. Paul, Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So be sure to join us next Tuesday for another Postmortem. Watch 48 Hours Saturdays at 10, 9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount+. And be sure to follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music or Wondery app.